History as it happens, January 26, 2023. When the press was really partisan.
Don't be rude.
Attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude. No, I'm not going to give you a question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you stay categorical?
You are fake news.
The press has become so dishonest that if we don't talk about it, we are doing a tremendous disservice to the American people.
The fake media is trying to silence us.
No, I never discussed increasing it. I want it in perfect shape. That was just fake news by NBC, which gives a lot of fake news. You know you're a fake. You know that your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake. And most of you, and not all of you, but the people are wise to you. That's why you have a lower approval rating than you've ever had before, times probably 3.
Public trust in the mass media to accurately report the news is at a low point. And a big reason why is the perception, or maybe the reality, that the media is partisan or politically biased against conservatives and Republicans. Or if we're talking about conservative media, biased against the left. Charges of partisanship in the press are about as old as the Republic itself. So what's changed, and why does it seem so much worse today than ever before? That's next as we report history as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
By the time you get to the first contested elections and presidential elections in 1796, 1800, readers are flocking and the politicians are flocking to use newspapers that will take their side, or at least print things that they would like to see printed.
Here's a Gallup poll from a couple of months ago. 7% of Americans have a great deal of trust and confidence in the media. 27% have a fair amount. 38% have none at all. Yes, none at all. In newspapers, TV, and radio, the first time the percentage of Americans with no trust at all in the media is higher than the percentage with a great deal or a fair amount of trust combined, according to Gallup. This poll also showed some historic data going back to the 1970s and in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, when the news media exposed government lies and corruption on a massive scale. 72% of Americans had a great deal or fair amount of confidence that the news they consumed was accurate. So I grew up in the post-Watergate era. I was born in 75. When I became a journalist in the late 1990s, the notion that the mainstream media was liberal and therefore unfair to Republicans and conservatives was there, just as it is today. But when I got into the business, the New York Times had just launched its website. There weren't blogs or YouTube or the gazillion alternate sources of information that exist today. It was before Fox News grew to dominate cable news, before Twitter and Facebook made it possible for liars and charlatans of all political persuasions to disseminate their nonsense to huge audiences. And it was also long before Donald Trump went to the White House.
Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of lives by
time that you bought. The argument is that you bought yourself some time and you didn't use it to prepare hospitals. You didn't use it to ramp up testing. Right now,
you're so disgraceful. It's so disgraceful the way you say that. Let me just listen. I just went over it.
Or this rant supposed to make people
I just went over it
in an unprecedented crisis.
Nobody thought we should do it, and when I did it.
But what did you do with the time that you bought?
You know
the
we
month
did.
of February.
You know what we did?
Gap.
What do you do?
Month of February.
What do you do when you have no case in the whole United States?
You had cases
when
in February.
Excuse me, you reported it. 0 cases, 0 deaths on January 17th.
February, the entire
January. I said in January.
Your video has a complete gap.
On January 30th.
What did your administration do in February with the time that your travel ban got you?
A lot. And in fact, we'll give you a list. What we did, in fact, part of it was up there. We did a lot. Look. You know you're a fake. You know that.
The question
But when journalists make honest mistakes, they should own up to them. Sometimes, and a lot of times you don't. But there's a difference. There's a very big. I'm sorry. I'm not finished. There's a very big difference between making honest mistakes and purposefully misleading the American people, something that happens regularly. You can't say, I'm not done. You cannot say that it's an honest mistake when you're purposely putting out information that you know to be false, or when you're taking information that hasn't been validated, that hasn't been offered any credibility, and that has been continually denied by a number of people, including people with direct knowledge of an instance.
And the second half of that montage was Sarah Huckabee Sanders, then the White House spokesperson, sparring with Jim Acosta and other White House reporters. So if you listen to the podcast regularly, you know my position on Trump. He is unfit for office. But when it comes to journalism, his presidency created pressure inside and outside newsrooms to discard old standards of neutrality or objectivity or both sides, balance, whatever term you use, and to treat him differently as a threat to democracy. Was that good for journalism? Have you seen Matt Taibbi's list of all the unsubstantiated claims about Trump that were published by major, credible news outlets that turned out to be bogus? So I still mostly trust what I read in major newspapers. I'm talking about the news articles, not the op-ed pages. But the problem is, or maybe it's not a problem depending on your perspective, newspaper circulation is much smaller than it used to be. In the days of newspapers, radio, and the three major TV networks as the primary sources of news are long gone. The days when what Walter Cronkite said really mattered are long over. Can you even name the network evening news anchors today? When I was a kid, it was Rather, Brokaw, and Jennings. Legacy media now compete for your attention with, as mentioned, cable, podcasts, YouTube channels, many of which make no effort to present an accurate picture of what's going on today. They're designed to mislead and divide, or to cheerlead for one political party over another. Just like it was for most of U.S. history. Right from the beginning, the press was partisan, and historians have argued that those early newspapers and pamphlets encouraged Americans to participate in democracy, rather than turn them into cynical, apathetic citizens. Jeff Pasley is an expert on the history of the partisan press at the University of Missouri, and he is the author of The Tyranny of the Printers, Newspaper Politics in the Early American Republic. Jeff Pasley, welcome.
Thanks for having me. Glad to do it.
Well, I'm happy that you agreed to be the one to take on this subject, which everyone has an opinion on, right? And depending on how you answer that question, do we have a partisan press, will win you friends or enemies. But why don't we start with a broader question? Why is this issue important right now? I think we agree that, yes, there used to be a very partisan press. There are partisan news outlets today. There are all types of bias, different forms of bias, right? But why is this issue important now?
Well, I think it's changed so much because of the decline of the business model ever since they got rid of the fairness doctrine and sort of started deregulating the broadcast networks, the business model's been declining, and then the conventional newspaper is not dead yet, but almost dead. The replacement of that by, first cable news and radio, but then sort of blogs and internet-based publications really has created a situation that's quite a bit more like the 19th century partisan press where, there would have been many, many more small outlets, very tightly fixed on certain audiences. And I guess it's important because there seems to be so little agreement on, at least people have the sense that there's little agreement on even the kind of basic facts of things. Also just clearly is a huge strain in our institutions. So.
Absolutely. When it comes to democracy, right, it's been an axiom since the beginning that our country needs a healthy, independent, accurate press in order to have an informed public. And these days, depending on which side of the aisle you're on, the other side is spreading misinformation everywhere, whether it's about whoever happens to be president.
Can we address that beginning thing?
Yeah.
That way you express that's more like been the ideal since possibly the 1920s or 30s. I mean, there's certainly the idea that information, that the public needed information, accurate information and full information was something that existed.
That's right, yeah.
From the beginning.
Not an independent press.
The one thing that's provided, not even in the Constitution, but in the Bill of Rights, is that Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of the press, which really only meant that there wouldn't be a licensing scheme. Beyond that, they certainly all thought it was important, but it's not really something that's provided for. Jefferson is of the founders that we talk about now is the one who talked about this the most often. And he probably would have said he definitely thought newspapers needed to be spread across everywhere, but he really thought of it more in terms of information. And in terms of how it was done, it was more just raw materials. In other words, you needed to be able to disseminate things like the texts of laws, a treaty that had been signed that needed to be publicized, just kind of basic information on things like who was in office, what laws had they passed. Jefferson's thought, and he kind of had to revise this, was that if you have a Republican form of government and the people were kind of informed about what it was doing, that the people wouldn't be suspicious and things could go forward happily. What they all ran into, of course, was that, they were kind of assuming that there'd be sort of a consensus that the various elites would reach, that there wouldn't be massive controversies or disagreements especially over the basics of what was happening. Of course, once the French Revolution breaks out and someone with very strong ideas like Alexander Hamilton gets in and starts making policy, then they find out, actually they do disagree. And they actually think, there are things that people need to know about, that they need to be told about. That's actually, where what we would call the partisan press comes in. And when we were corresponding, you used the term accountability journalism, as in where the public is informed about wrongdoing in government. Well, the only force that was ever going to do that was someone's political enemies. Jefferson first arranges for there to be a newspaper that prints stuff about the French side of the French Revolution, or more from French sources, and he also then wants to get out the word that there are problems with Hamilton's financial policies.
Yeah. Now, let me ask about the 1790s now, since you introduced it. That's where I was going next. Historians of this period, such as yourself, are very lucky in that the former British colonies, the new states, were home to countless pamphleteers and presses, and there were many newspapers. So there's a huge documentary record for you to research. And in your book, The Tyranny of the Printers, you talk about the partisan Republican press, you just alluded to it, challenging the Federalists and their friendly newspapers. So these early newspapers were very much political entities that had the patronage of the parties, insofar that they were parties. They weren't quite like modern.
Yeah, it would be more of the financial support of individuals and officials, so like one of the key things was printing contracts. In other words, the government doesn't have its own printing presses, so if laws and things are going to be printed, then someone has to be contracted to do that. So basically, who was chosen to do that kind of printing be determined by an official. So Hamilton would direct that to his friendly newspaper, or a newspaper that was really more friendly to the government, to be honest. And Jefferson didn't actually quite have the printing contracts, so he hired a person to translate French documents in his office. So the various kinds of redirection we would say political corruption of things that ought to be independent, like who's hired for a government job and who gets a government contract. But
our modern sense of conflicts of interest or ethical conflicts didn't really apply in that.
No, it didn't really exist.
Yeah. And readers who read these newspapers didn't really have an expectation of objectivity, right? They knew they were reading a partisan press.
Well, I don't know that they did. Certainly by the end of this, by the time, you get to the first contested elections and presidential elections in 1796, 1800, readers are flocking and the politicians are flocking to use newspapers that will take their side, or at least print things that they would like to see printed. In terms of what readers expected, we don't know much about that. Of course, readers, objective is obviously a really 20th century term. Initially they just would have, like, a big deal was just printing the debates, right, of Congress, and maybe which one got printed or which one got mentioned would be sort of how how something would be emphasized.
In Gordon Wood's book, Empire of Liberty, he has a big chapter on the 1790s and how divided the country was and how vicious the attacks became. And he says the Republicans and the Jeffersonians were better at the newspaper game than the Federalists were. They didn't quite understand that this is something you should be doing and that it could be effective. And Wood makes the point that a lot of what the Republicans said about John Adams and the Federalists was scurrilous, that these reports were gossipy, inaccurate, designed to assassinate character. We often think about the importance of, like I said at the top, information as a pillar of democracy and a free press, right? I guess my question is, was this actually good for the political system? I mean, it probably engaged people, right?
Well, it was good in the sense that if you regard the competitive elections and political debate outside the halls of government as democracy, then it was good because that wasn't something that was planned to be part of the system. Everyone's heard of the Alien Sedition Acts. It may not be clear to people what those were actually about. The Federalists, who could still control the government at that point, essentially shut down political debate, criticism coming from the press. The Sedition Act attempts to make that illegal, essentially. And not just scurrilous stuff, but even just ideas that would tend to bring, it has very vague language, like would tend to bring the president or any of the officials of the government into disrepute. So this could be scurrilous, maybe it isn't. There's a debate over whether or not Washington and Adams were following policies that were too pro-British or following policies that tended to push the U.S. more toward a monarchical system. They're talking about tendencies. They're talking about where this is all leading. For the most part, it's not quite scandal in the same sense that we probably think of it as.
Yeah.
But in terms of the role of all this, I mean, in all seriousness, without what we would call the partisan press that develops, the existence of that hadn't been vindicated by the failure of the Sedition Act to shut that all down. It's hard to see how that system even continues, even the good aspects of it, because everyone should be quite clear that...
Well, the Sedition Act backfired, right? It spurred the creation of a lot of Republican newspapers.
It itself became so much of an issue that it didn't succeed in its goal. And I know this is actually hard for people to hear now, right? And it's hard to, because we look at it now, and I'm also horrified by a lot of the partisanship that we see in the media now, but the idea that it's against democracy is right, that's not historically correct.
Yeah, well, some historians have said that when newspapers started to become more objective, again, a problematic term there, that people became more apathetic, and that when the press was openly and avowedly partisan in the run-up to the Civil War, we're going to get to that era too, that it engaged people. It engaged them in the political system, in the political process, and it made them vote.
I would tend to say the two things probably go together. I don't know if I would attribute the disengagement of people with a different approach that's taken by the media solely. I mean, there's all kinds of things that were done in that time. We're talking about the early 20th century, things that nobody would argue with now, like secret ballots, not allowing campaigning at the polls, voter registration, were measures that were put in to kind of calm down the political process and frankly put up a few more barriers, especially for working class people, and to make voting to more of an intellectual choice, right? A rational choice, as opposed to communities coming out and fighting with each other, which is more what it was. It was an engaged electorate, engaged in the sense of participating. They're engaged in the sense of marching in parades. They're also sometimes engaged by money being handed around and by riots at the polls.
Yeah, to your point about the notion that a partisan press was antithetical to a healthy democracy, that's not true when you look at the 1790s and beyond. I guess that was your point.
That is my point. I would go as far as to say that you really wouldn't have American democracy as we think of it without the partisan press. I mean, it was one of the main points of controversy and one of the main carriers of a legitimate political opposition, of debate that goes on about government outside of government. It goes along with political parties. It goes along with even the idea of competitive elections. But I think that's something that people have trouble with too. I mean, George Washington did, that's for sure.
Yeah, he didn't have a competitive election. Really.
No, he didn't have to deal with it. And any time there was a hint of it, he did not like it.
He had a thin skin when it came to criticism, but he's not alone when it comes to politicians. So more modern style newspapers sprung up in the 19th century. The penny press, which have been referred to as the forerunners of the modern newspaper, are a lot different than the pamphlets or the earlier newspapers of the 1790s. Many of them had small circulation, and they were still partisan journals. So I'm getting to my question here. Hold on one moment. Reading from an article by Penn State, their Civil War era digital archiving project. Because every time I've read a book about the Civil War era, there's always citations from the era's newspapers. And almost always the author makes sure you know when you're reading this was either a Democrat or a Whig or a Republican newspaper, especially when it came to the issue of slavery, right? You had to know what their perspective was.
You did.
And according to this archive I was citing, by 1860, over 80% of the nation's newspapers were small circulation partisan journals that promoted the interests of a given political party and in turn were sustained by the subscriptions of party members and government patronage. Almost the entire media, the news media, right? There was no radio, there was no television in those days, obviously. The news media was partisan.
No, it's true. And that is a good point they make. Probably depends on whether you think of it in terms of readers or you think of it in terms of the actual newspaper. And it's very true. Throughout the 19th century, still, it's local weeklies, 2 to 6 in any given town across the political spectrum. I mean, that's one thing that's different about this whole world. There's never just one, in any place. There's generally, in a big city, there'll be 15 or 20. In a smaller place, maybe there's only like 2 to 6, but
with an evening edition too.
Well, about multiple editions and weeklies, and so by the 19th century, I would, by 1860, and especially because of the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, the sort of demand for information about those things. There were newspapers in big cities that had big staffs, that really were news gathering organizations. That's something that's kind of new in the middle of the 19th century. Is newspapers that A, had large staffs that actively gathered the news, and then B, actually were kind of dealing in mass circulations to a degree. In other words, some of them, where they would actually be selling copies on the streets. Something like the New York Tribune, Horace Greeley's paper would be something that would be sold, was read all over the country and sold in the hundreds of thousands. And so that's an increasing trend. I mostly read about these older newspapers, and they tend to be like 4 pages, no headlines. Actually looks like a shopper on both sides. It's got ads on both sides and only has actual prose stuff in the middle often.
More like a pamphlet in a newspaper.
Well, I mean, like a shopper. It's like the classified ads with a couple pages.
You call that a shopper, not a circular? I forgot what I was saying.
Circular, yes. Okay, I don't know. Right. But by the time we get to the mid-20th century, they're gathering news. The wire services exist. They got headlines. They're starting to write stories, which is something that's new. One of the things that's kind of radically different about journalism as opposed to just newspapers is that, journalists sift the information and put it into some kind of narrative. The older newspapers, it would have just been bits of information, raw information, or essays, right? And hardly ever anyone writing a little history of what happened, the way that journalists are supposed to do. So that's all starting to emerge as the cities get bigger and there's news to cover. It doesn't become nonpartisan thereby, though, right? I mean, indeed, if you read those big city newspapers like the penny press or the Civil War era newspapers, they're unbelievably partisan, right? I mean, they're unbelievably, we would say, biased. Maybe it's just towards the Union or the Confederacy, but also toward presidential candidates, towards any individual thing that's happening. Even if it's like crime, they're like pursuing the criminal or defending them. Commercialism and mass circulation, the emergence of objectivity and neutrality politically is something that is actually quite separate. It doesn't really happen until there's a lot of consolidation in the 20th century, to be honest.
That was my next stop with you. There are many forms of bias. partisan bias is one kind of bias. We're actually doing the work of a political party, which may or may not have an ideological bias to it, right? I mean,
Right.
not all conservative bias, for instance, benefits the Republican Party, just as there could be a newspaper that's liberally biased, but is also reporting on the things the Democratic Party is doing wrong, if you get my point. But we'll return to that subject later when we talk about our current moment. You gave an interview on C-SPAN, actually, about your book some years ago, where you stated the assassination of William McKinley early in his second term in 1901 was a turning point in the evolution of newspapers from these unabashedly political or partisan publications to more professional, neutral, we use neutral rather than objective, professional, neutral outlets.
That would be one of the places I would point to if I had to pick one moment, right? You know, this is one of the themes of Teddy Roosevelt. I mean, this is where the term muckraker comes from, right? So specifically, McKinley's assassinated by Leon Czolgosz, I think that's how you pronounce his name, who's an anarchist, you know, someone who'd been to meetings with Emma Goldman, and he probably acted more on his own. It was definitely like a political assassination, and it was something where he, you know, claims he was doing it for the poor, a blow against the rich for the poor. So it's something that's seen as political, and it's particularly blamed on the Hearst press, right?
Yellow journalism.
Yellow journalism. And Hearst was, now he's more famous as the guy that Citizen Kane is based on. But at the time, he would be Democratic presidential candidate, someone who had a string of newspapers all over the country that were just really partisan on a level that we wouldn't really even imagine.
And there was sensationalist.
And sensationalist and very widely read. In terms of percentage of the population, probably much more than like Fox News or something like that, right? You know, Fox News, which has a rather niche audience compared to the total population, whereas the Hearst papers were in every city. You know, there were hundreds of thousands of people reading them in every city. There's a partisan thing where a lot of the traditional Democrats didn't like Hearst, and the Republicans really didn't like Hearst because he's this chaotic force at a time when it was felt that certain elements of the yellow press were inciting the population to violence. And it, you know, became a kind of talking point to use against the Hearst press. And Teddy Roosevelt, right after he becomes president, one of his first uses of the bully pulpit, as he called it later, was to like call for a essentially more responsible press. Really, it's over the first couple decades of the 20th century. The old style of sensationalist journalism just kind of goes out of fashion. And this is also part of the so-called progressive era, where there's all kinds of ways in which all kinds of institutions are trying to become more professional, right? This is the moment when journalism schools are started, right? I mean, right around this time.
You mean James Callender, who went with all that gossipy stuff about Jefferson, never went to journalism school?
No, he never went to journalism school. You know, Joseph Pulitzer, I guess ironically, was also considered sort of a yellow journalist, not as bad as Hearst, but who sort of pledged to push the industry towards a more professional standard. And like, I'm not sure that the idea that all journalists have to go to journalism school, I'm not sure that's actually worked. But it's certainly the case that there was a call that became quite successful at the highest levels of journalism for journalists to be more educated, right?
Yes.
And essentially to be more responsible members of the national, to share their values a bit more and to be more responsible in terms of the things that they put out.
Well, I'm with you because I didn't go to journalism school either. I will say this, though. I mean, when I became a journalist, a broadcast journalist in the 1990s, I was well aware of the standards and the ethics of my profession. There were professional standards that the places I worked at adhered to, and I also eventually started working for the Associated Press, which of course has a style guide, etc. I'm not an expert on old newspapers, but when I've looked back at old newspapers, say from the 30s or the 40s, stuff about World War II, whatever, those look like today's newspapers. And
they do.
Yeah,
I
the
mean,
quality of the reporting was probably quite good too, as far as I know.
And I would say that was increasingly the case going back to like the 20s and 30s. But again, especially at the highest levels, right?
And I'll also say, I mentioned this to you when we were corresponding, that I was born in 1975. So when I grew up, I took it for granted, even before I became a journalist, that newspapers were, of course, not supposed to be partisan or really exhibit any type of bias, right? Americans had just been through this terrible period when newspapers exposed wrongdoing in Vietnam and Watergate, right? This is some of the finest journalism our country has ever known. And to me, that's what I thought of in my memory today, looking back on it. That was the role of a newspaper. Today, some people would say, are you kidding me? You know, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they are liberal outlets, they're woke outlets, whatever. So we are living in a partisan media era, but it's different than the one that you studied in the 1790s or in the 19th century.
Well, I think if you look at it as a whole, it's getting more similar, especially if you include the internet. I mean, it's interesting that you mentioned, 1975, that's an interesting...
Yeah. And let me just add that I don't believe the New York Times is a partisan outlet, but we'll get back to that in a minute.
I mean, what the New York Times and the Washington Post reflect is objective. Really, it really tends to mean one of two things. It means that they try to observe practices of balance, where if they ask a Democrat, they're going to include the opinion of a Republican, right? They'll pair things. The other thing it means is that objective tends to be judged on the basis of what is in the consensus values of the particular group that's reading it. So,
what sensibilities are those newspapers appealing to? That's where I would say, mainstream newspapers tend to appeal to more liberal sensibilities. I used to also work at a public radio station. We appeal to more liberal sensibilities.
They do tend to be more liberal. I mean, I guess I don't think of the New York Times and Washington Post as woke because to me, they're so... The New York Times is like the local newspaper of the kind of Manhattan elite, right? Things that they see as consensual are treated that way, and things that are outside of what they think they have a consensus around get treated differently.
I'm at the Washington Times now, and we have a conservative reputation, but we're not partisan. We're not doing Republican Party news. Our news articles, which I tell everyone, just don't look at the headline, read the article. You won't sense a lot of bias there. We may appeal to, just as the New York Times appeals to more liberal sensibilities, we might appeal to more right-of-center sensibilities. Our op-ed page is conservative, but we're not doing Republican or conservative news here. The same way I don't think the New York Times does Democratic news. I mean, all the front-page articles they had about Hillary Clinton's email scandal.
Some of the stuff that goes on in the so-called mainstream media is like worse than partisan because it's like the balance thing is so rote.
But I used to always push back against what I always believed was a canard. You work for the liberal media. So I've worked for the Associated Press, Bloomberg, public radio stations. Never once in any of those jobs did anyone ever ask me or expect me to abandon neutrality or to present a story in a way that would elide certain facts to the benefit of one party or the other. In a sense, I was at professional news organizations that many people today would say, well, you're partisan, you're biased.
Well, I think the sort of professional ethos that you're talking about is one that, it's really an artifact of what we're going to look back and see now as a very brief and particular time in American history. Some people call it the New Deal order. Some people call it the era of the liberal consensus. And I don't mean liberal in the sense that Republicans would complain about it now. I mean, it's the liberal consensus that was against Nazism and communism. But it was one where, for instance, the broadcast media are regulated from the Federal Communications Act of 1930, whatever. Airways are considered public, and there's a requirement of balance. And so there are certain standards and practices that get adopted by the broadcast news media that then people got used to for that period. And it's the period, of course, where TV news was invented and where most of the period where radio news was invented. So, broadcast news was created in that regulated environment where there was a kind of requirement, and of course the fairness doctrine was quite a pain for broadcast media because it meant there was a practical reason to never do anything too partisan. You'd have to get some irritating person would take up some of your airtime responding. Right.
Yeah, Walter Cronkite and his broadcasts about the Vietnam War, which when you watch them, he is very measured in the way he goes about his reporting.
He is.
Right?
And in fact, it's a bit of a myth that
he was some type of liberal opponent.
I brought, here's a prop, The Uncensored War by Daniel Hallen. Great book, the media in Vietnam, that clears up a couple of, it is not correct to say that the media was even against Vietnam.
Now, at
particularly
first, they were
early.
not. No, there were many patriotic Americans among the journalists who were covering the war in the early years.
With both Vietnam and Watergate, what you see is that the media shifts when the institutions start to shift, right? By the time the New York Times, Walter Cronkite are actually kind of visibly against the war, or critical of the war, at least in some of their reporting, it's after there's already considerable internal criticism. There's actually parts of the Democratic Party that have started to criticize it. So, it's very heavily driven by institutions. In Watergate, all credit to the reporters in Watergate. But what people forget about Watergate and the whole Nixon situation is that Nixon was facing a overwhelmingly Democratic Congress, right? In other words, their institutions were in play against Nixon in a way that in some ways made the journalistic aspect possible. Internal critics of that, and there were institutions that started to get in motion, and it's the institutions and the adverse Congress that gets rid of Nixon as much as the media. The media plays a role, but the media, it's not a liberal bias situation.
No, and they were reporting on what was going wrong. And for a while there during Watergate, other reporters were knocking down those stories by these two up-and-coming journalists, Woodward and Bernstein. Other reporters were poo-pooing their scoops.
No, they were. And there were lots of poo-pooing that was going on if you were reading Midwestern. You were reading the St. Louis Globe-Democrat, which is a Republican paper. Pat Buchanan was the columnist for. They were definitely slapping down. See, partly this liberal media thing is a bit of an illusion because that was a moment, the 60s and 70s was a moment when the media was regulated and it was increasingly consolidated, right? So, one of the things that would have been true even in the 60s, and this is why you're born in 75, that's right around the time when it would have no longer been the norm for there to be a Republican and a Democratic daily in most cities. But that was actually up through the 60s, right? Even in the St. Louis and Minneapolis's and, most cities would have had to. Just what happens in the 60s and 70s is often one of them is the evening paper, and the evening papers start to collapse, so they merge with their rival, so there's only one paper. So what was happening is that the Republicans were kind of feeling like they were facing this increasingly monolithic press, right? And they sort of were. Not that was really against them in some organized partisan way, but they didn't have friends in the media the way they would have even 10 or 20 years earlier.
And the National Review has been on this one for decades, right? About how the mainstream national press, talking about the major broadcast networks and the major newspapers,
surviving ones.
Yeah, we're not friendly to conservatives.
There's a point where conservatives in the surviving form of national media were kind of at loggerheads.
I don't feel like those publications are the issue today when we talk about partisan media.
No.
To our earlier discussion about the health of democracy and the early partisan press, how it actually helped, right, get our politics up and going. Today, I'm not sure if the current media climate is all that helpful to democracy. And it's not because people today are more prone to believe crazy stuff than they were 200 years ago. Americans, all people, are susceptible to believing conspiracy theories and falsehoods and, whatever.
Sure. And they definitely were back in 100 or 200 years ago, probably even more. Well,
I guess I'm just not sure what the answer is, because I certainly don't support censorship or any type of media consolidation that would make it impossible for stuff that I disagree with to exist. But let's just be honest, there's a ton of stuff out there on both sides of the political spectrum and outside of politics, say in the arena of public health, that is pure garbage that gets audiences in the millions, right? From cable television to right-wing radio, there's really no successful left-wing radio, to podcasts, to YouTube channels. We're in a different universe than we've ever been, and I guess I don't really have a question. I'm just interested in what you think about the health of democracy with all this. There's more information out there than ever before, but so much of it is garbage.
I agree with you. Problem is, if democracy means that people's opinions are being expressed in the political arena, then I think that's happening. It's just based on garbage information. One of the problems we're facing is that the And this is something I, address a little bit in my work every once in a while, is that even back in the days of the partisan press that I talked about, the tradition was that politics depended on the media, but the media was privately owned. Even in the times when they made their money from politics, they sold subscriptions, they got printing contracts, they're private businesses. So there was always a business model that sustained it. And the problem now is we don't have a business model anymore, since the internet kind of sucked up all the advertising, and since, the broadcast media is no longer regulated, there's no commercial model that actually supports giving accurate, vetted information. One of the things that I think is like not just a danger to the republic, but a danger to humanity is the way that the only information, and I'm not just talking about news, I mean, even like history.
Oh, yeah.
That infotainment, right? In other words, there's a retreat from letting people study history or the workings of society, the economy in academic settings from an academic perspective. Instead, it's all just being kind of left to infotainment. And so you get situations where, it is way, 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 and people are easier to find out, and people are way, way better informed about like ancient aliens and Bigfoot than they are about actually what's going on in their state legislature or
well, there are no local newspapers reporting on that stuff. I guess those are History Channel programs you just referenced. I used to watch the History Channel.
The Discovery Channel. Yeah.
I used to watch the History Channel a lot, and I stopped because they stopped doing shows about history.
When it first started, the joke was to call it the Hitler Channel because it was all World War II documentaries, and now you'd wish it was World War II documentaries.
On the left in recent years, I know a lot of people who are sensible people who, because of whatever media outlets they were watching or reading, came to believe that Donald Trump was essentially a Russian spy or some type of direct Russian asset. I mean, this stuff is all over the place.
The infotainment problem is across the spectrum, and what's sad, in some ways, I guess it's easy to not worry about a reality series about ancient aliens. Even things that purport to be actually providing information are actually more entertaining people with outrage about whatever they want to be outraged about. But that seems to be the business. It's partly the public's fault, I guess, in the sense that's what the public will want. That's always been the problem that objective media or the neutral media has had, is that the other kind does engage people more. And it's in some ways, that's what, the Hearst press, for instance, was hugely popular. They sold more papers than the others, partly because they did provide the red meat.
And today that takes the form today of giving people ammunition for their partisan arguments.
Yes, that's right.
So if you watch MSNBC all day long, you'll be outraged about what conservatives are doing to destroy the country. If you watch Fox News all day long, you'll be outraged about what liberals are doing to destroy the country.
And probably I would say that the Fox version is probably more extreme, but it doesn't probably seem so to the... No. You're certainly right, especially hanging out in a college town like I do. You really get more of the other side in terms of what people are torqued about.
Jeff Pasley, historian, University of Missouri, and author of The Tyranny of the Printers. We thank you for giving us plenty to think about today. On the next episode of History as It Happens, there was a time when Ukraine, a brief period of time, when Ukraine had nuclear weapons on its territory, but it returned them to Russia. What if Ukraine had those nukes today? We're going to speak to the expert on the disarmament of the former Soviet republics after the Cold War. Next, as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.